Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. Yes, as Teresa was saying, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. So I am here as the mother of a severely disabled child, and the first part of my presentation will be about our personal experience of personalised medicine. This has led to all kinds of wonderful things for us as a family, and I'll come back to them in the second part of my talk, where we'll be talking a bit more about how patients have been informing what the work of Genomics England looks like. Next slide, please. So this is Sam. He's 8 years old now, and he is the reason that I'm here. Next slide, please. When Sam was born, we thought he was perfect. He was eating well and sleeping well, and we could put him down and see to his sister when she needed our attention. She's 2 years older than him, so maybe you can imagine how chaotic life could be with the two small children together. But by the time he was 3 months old, we realized that he wasn't reacting to any visual stimuli, and we were concerned and took him to the doctors, and the ophthalmologist said, "Oh, I think this is a delay in his visual maturation. There's nothing structurally wrong with his eyes, but he just isn't making sense of the world yet. So take him home, show him things, and come back when he's a year old if you're still having trouble." And that's a really frightening thing to be told, that your child has a severe visual impairment when you really weren't expecting any trouble. There's no family history of anything like that. Unfortunately, by the time he was 1, the paediatricians were also concerned about Sam because he didn't seem to be developing in the way that you would expect, and his development was further behind than you would expect from a child who had a visual impairment. So they did lots of other testing and examined him carefully and decided that he had a global developmental delay, which again was impacting quite significantly on all aspects of his development. The challenge at that point for us was to try and get our heads around and adjust to the prospect of having a child who would be very different from his sister, and what that meant for us as a family was quite challenging. We carried on trying to do the best for him, but between his first and second birthdays, he started having seizures, and we had to go to hospital 7 times in a year. That was a lot of ambulances to have him treated when he had various different kinds of seizures, and these got more severe until his final one was a status epilepticus, which, as you may know, is a very dangerous form of epilepsy. And we had to put him in the intensive care unit for 24 hours. And we were advised that it was possible that he might not wake up from his induced coma. So at that point, we really wondered whether we might lose him. Thankfully, he came around, and now that we had a diagnosis of epilepsy, he was prescribed medication, which has stopped that from happening again. But he does still have seizures on a fairly regular basis, although they're not as severe as those. Today, he is still non-verbal. He makes a few sounds sometimes, which are recognizable, but he doesn't use any words. He doesn't walk. He's registered blind. He's fed with a spoon, and he has daily medications for all sorts of different things, including his movement disorder and his epilepsy. But we love him very much, and he's a delight to be with. Next slide, please. So you might have heard already during this conference about the diagnostic odyssey that patients with rare conditions go through. Ours was shorter than some, but longer than many. It was quite a challenging time as a family to be there. He was an enigma despite many tests that were carried out by the National Health Service at the time. Some of these were quite invasive, involving lumbar punctures and nerve conduction testing, as well as lots of blood tests. And none of them came up with an answer, because at the time the NHS didn't have the tools to find out what was wrong with him. So in 2015, we were offered the chance to join the 100,000 Genomes programme, and blood samples were taken from myself and from my husband and from my son as a trio for whole genome sequencing. The benefits of trio sequencing are phenomenal in that they can spot whether something has developed in a child on their own, or whether this is something which they've inherited from either parent. Genomics England analysed our genomes and found 43 genes of interest in Sam that may have had something to do with his difficulties, but reported this back to our local clinical geneticist, and she read around the subject, and it looked like the GRIN1 gene might be causing the difficulties for Sam. Unfortunately, nobody in the NHS in England at the time had diagnosed a GRIN1 gene before, and so she was unsure as well about whether this was an accurate diagnosis. So she downloaded 3 papers, which were then the sum total of academic knowledge about GRIN1 genes, and sent them to us and asked us to read the papers from these academic journals and said, can you recognise your son's symptoms and characteristics from the way these patients have been described in the academic literature? And we read them, and although the papers described a slightly more severe phenotype than we see in Sam, it did seem very likely. And so we were able to confirm her tentative diagnosis that GRIN1 was probably the problem here. And for me, that was a fundamental shift in the traditional relationship between the clinician and the patient or their family. And that is one which has driven forward everything that I've done since, and something which I think is a common and important feature to rare disease genetics, because families do have a very detailed knowledge of their own children, and patients have a very detailed knowledge of their own symptoms, and they can provide you with evidence that will help support your tentative diagnoses in some of these things which are coming forward now. As I mentioned, Sam was the first person to be diagnosed with the GRIN1 disorder in Britain. And the benefit of trio testing for us also meant that we could tell he had a de novo mutation, so he'd not inherited this from either of his parents. And that was a really reassuring thing to find out, because it meant that his sister need not worry about passing something on to any children that she may have in the future. And my sister, who at the time was thinking about starting a family, also didn't need to worry too much about that either. Next slide, please. Now, the impact of this diagnosis at the time gave us something that we could type into the internet search engines, and it gave us the opportunity to find a community around the world. Within the space of 2 days of our diagnosis, I was able to find a group on Facebook based in America who were set up to help families with GRIN1 disorders. And that was a wonderful thing, to suddenly be able to see photographs of other people's children who have the same condition, and to recognise the similarities between them all, both in terms of the characteristics, but also in terms of how hard the parents were searching for answers. Excuse me. So that online community was phenomenally powerful and really helpful to us as a family. And I was delighted to be able to help set up a non-profit organisation which was rooted in that group, called the Cure GRIN Foundation, the Cure GRIN Foundation, which is based in the States and is now developing in partnership with scientists that we've been able to meet in the course of our investigations. We're now helping to develop a database of GRIN disorder patients around the world, and hopefully using that information to drive forward research into therapies and potentially one day a cure. And that community of patients is growing all the time. Not only are we finding that people around the world want to come and join us every week, we get more families signing up from countries which may not have the same types of healthcare systems as we do in the UK or in the US. But we're also finding that more and more patients are being diagnosed with a GRIN1 disorder in Britain, partly because the work that we've been part of has enabled the GRIN1 genes and others like it to be put on the panels that are used in gene testing children who present at clinic with undiagnosed developmental delays, epilepsy and visual disorders. So we have played a very small part, but a very important part in moving the understanding of these things forward as a family, which has been wonderful. Next slide, please. So the lessons that I'd like to share with you today that I think are probably important for us to think about here are these: that patients and their families hold pieces of the jigsaw that can help to find new diagnoses, and that we should never assume that a family doesn't have the capacity to understand. Parents are the most motivated people in the world to learn new things when it affects their children, and they have got the power and the interest to try and drive things forward, especially in rare disease. There are thousands of different conditions, and no funding body in the world is going to be able to help them all. So we really need to tap into that community of motivated people to try and find more people to join their community, but also to, again, then use the skills that they have to drive forward fundraising and potentially forward into the clinical development of new treatments. The other point I wanted to make at this stage was talking a little bit about consent. Obviously, we gave our consent to share Sam's genetic data and our own and our life course health records with Genomics England in order to get this diagnosis. And at the time, the motivation behind that made it seem very obvious to us that this was the right way forward. Routine medicine hadn't been able to help us, and so we were very willing to share this sensitive information with an organisation that we trusted in order to try and to have a hope of finding out what was wrong with him. But we need to be clear about what genetics can and cannot currently do. People in my orbit have previously been told that if their whole genome is going to be sequenced, they think that means that it's going to be, the whole genome will be analysed. And we need to be very careful about this language, because clearly science is doing great things, but it hasn't yet got to the stage of knowing what every single part of a genome does. And I think a lot of people, when you tell them you're going to write down their entirety of their DNA, get really excited about the prospect of then you being able to read all of that book, as it were, and immediately understand all the words that you see in there. And we know that's not the case, but I think it's a really important thing to make sure that when we're signing people up for whole genome sequencing and for personalised medicine, that we also explain the limitations as to what's currently possible and what's currently not possible. A lot of people have no science training at all, but a lot of people can also understand a lot about what you're trying to achieve if you can use analogies. So, for example, the idea that your whole genome is effectively the encyclopedia of you, and you've got these 3.2 billion letters, which are written down in the book of you as your genome. You can explain that concept quite straightforwardly to a wide range of people, that the book of you has all these letters in it, and then we can go in with a microscope or a magnifying glass and look at different parts of that. I think that can be quite a useful analogy. Our own geneticist helps us to understand the difference between different kinds of gene variants within the GRIN1 gene by explaining it as if they were beads on a necklace, that the necklace is the gene and the beads on the necklace are the individual letters within the necklace. And that will enable us to understand that if a bead is missing, or if there are two beads the same, or if there's a section which is not as we would expect it to be, then we can understand as non-scientists that might have an impact on how that gene is then working in the body. And the other analogy, which I think has been quite useful, has been when we're talking about gene panel testing, to use the comparison that this is like looking to see who's on a train by looking into the windows. You can see certain areas of the genome, but you can't see the whole thing. And you can use these windows, the genes that you're looking in your panel test, to look through the windows and see whether that section of the person's genome has got something of interest in it. None of these are difficult technical concepts to explain as analogies, and I think it helps people really understand at a very straightforward level what it means for them, because they don't need to know about the technical scientific work that you're doing. They just need to understand how it affects them and the people they love. So I'll pass on to Laura now, and I will come back later on and tell you a bit about what Genomics England is doing to make sure that patient voices are at the heart of what they do. Thank you.